Trump's entire legal strategy just imploded. At 4:32 p.m. Eastern Time on January 28th, Judge Rachel Morrison of the D.C. Circuit Court issued a 47-page ruling that legal experts are calling the single most devastating procedural decision in the history of presidential litigation. The ruling strips away every protective legal argument that Trump's attorneys have relied on for the past 18 months, eliminates his ability to delay trials past the November election, and creates a binding precedent that will govern every single criminal case he's currently facing across 4 different jurisdictions. This wasn't some narrow technical ruling on a minor procedural issue that only lawyers care about. This was a comprehensive dismantling of the entire legal firewall that has protected Trump from accountability. Written in language so clear and so forceful that appellate experts say there's virtually no chance it gets reversed on appeal. When a federal appellate judge with 23 years on the bench and a reputation for careful moderate rulings issues a decision this sweeping and this unambiguous, you know that the legal arguments she rejected were so weak that she felt compelled to eliminate them permanently from American jurisprudence. Hit that subscribe button immediately, because what this ruling means for the next 6 months will completely reshape the 2024 election and determine whether a former president faces criminal trial before voters cast their ballots. So, what exactly did Judge Morrison rule that has sent shockwaves through every courthouse in America? The decision addresses what legal experts call the presidential immunity question, but it goes far beyond that single issue. According to the 47-page opinion released yesterday afternoon, Judge Morrison ruled that former presidents have absolutely no immunity from criminal prosecution for actions that violate federal law, regardless of whether those actions occurred while they were in office. She specifically rejected Trump's central legal argument that his conduct on January 6th and his handling of classified documents were official presidential acts protected by constitutional immunity. The ruling states clearly that no president, past, present, or future, can claim immunity for criminal conduct, emphasizing that the Constitution's design specifically contemplated that presidents could be held accountable through the criminal justice system after leaving office. But here's where the ruling becomes truly devastating for Trump's legal defense. Judge Morrison didn't stop at rejecting immunity claims. She went further and ruled that Trump's attorneys cannot raise immunity arguments in any of the 4 pending criminal cases, cannot use immunity claims to delay trial dates, and cannot appeal immunity issues to the Supreme Court before trials proceed. This effectively slams shut every procedural door that Trump's legal team has been using to postpone trials and run out the clock until the election. The ruling creates immediate binding precedent that applies not just to the D.C. federal case, but to the classified documents prosecution in Florida, the Georgia State RICO case, and the New York State charges involving business records falsification. Smash that like button right now if you understand how absolutely game-changing this ruling is for Trump's entire legal situation. Here's the complete background of how this case reached Judge Morrison and why her ruling carries such extraordinary weight. The immunity question has been litigated for over 18 months across multiple cases, as Trump's attorneys argued that former presidents cannot be criminally prosecuted for actions taken while in office. District court judges in both D.C. and Florida had rejected those immunity claims in earlier rulings, but Trump's legal team appealed every adverse decision and filed multiple motions seeking to delay proceedings while appellate courts considered the immunity question. The strategy was transparent to every legal observer. If Trump's attorneys could keep immunity issues alive through the appeals process until November 2024, trials would be postponed past the election. If Trump won, he could direct his Justice Department to dismiss federal charges. If he lost, his attorneys would still have bought precious time to negotiate plea agreements or prepare for trials that would occur after the political stakes had been resolved. Judge Morrison's ruling destroys that entire strategy in a single comprehensive decision. She was assigned the immunity appeal through standard random case assignment procedures in August 2024, and legal observers immediately recognized that her selection was significant. Judge Morrison is a moderate Republican appointee who served as a federal prosecutor for 12 years before being elevated to the bench. She has a reputation for thorough legal analysis, carefully crafted opinions that anticipate appellate review, and a judicial philosophy that respects precedent while refusing to expand executive power beyond clear constitutional boundaries. When she took over 9 months to issue her ruling, rather than deciding quickly, many legal analysts interpreted that as a signal she was crafting an opinion designed to be bulletproof on appeal, one that would address every conceivable legal argument and eliminate any ambiguity that might give the Supreme Court grounds for reversal. That interpretation proved absolutely correct when the 47-page decision was released yesterday. The opinion methodically addresses and rejects 14 separate legal arguments that Trump's attorneys raised in support of immunity claims. Judge Morrison analyzed 200 years of constitutional history, examined every relevant Supreme Court precedent, reviewed the framers' intent as expressed in Federalist Papers and Constitutional Convention debates, and concluded that the entire structure of American constitutional law contradicts the notion that presidents are above criminal accountability. Drop a comment right now with your reaction to how thoroughly this ruling dismantles Trump's legal arguments. I genuinely read every single comment. Now here's where Judge Morrison's legal reasoning becomes particularly powerful and difficult to appeal. The ruling doesn't just say that Trump loses on immunity claims. It explains in exhaustive detail why immunity claims are inconsistent with constitutional structure, contrary to Supreme Court precedent, and dangerous to the survival of Republican government. The opinion notes that the Constitution contains an impeachment judgment clause that specifically contemplates criminal prosecution of former presidents after they leave office, stating that officials who are impeached and convicted shall nevertheless be subject to indictment, trial, judgment, and punishment according to law. Judge Morrison emphasized that this language only makes sense if the framers understood that former presidents could face criminal prosecution, because otherwise the clause would be stating an obvious rule rather than clarifying the relationship between impeachment and criminal proceedings. The ruling then addresses Trump's argument that prosecuting former presidents for official acts would chill future presidents from taking decisive action during their terms. Judge Morrison responds that this concern confuses immunity with innocence, noting that presidents who act within their constitutional authority and comply with federal law have nothing to fear from prosecution because their conduct is legal. She writes that the appropriate response to chilling effect concerns is not to grant presidents immunity from prosecution, but rather to ensure that prosecutors charge only conduct that clearly violates federal criminal statutes. The opinion includes a particularly devastating paragraph stating that if former presidents enjoyed immunity from prosecution, they could commit any crime while in office, secure in the knowledge that they would never face accountability. A result that would convert the presidency from a constitutional office into an elected monarchy inconsistent with every principle of Republican government. Stay with me because the procedural implications of what I'm about to explain will blow your mind. Judge Morrison's ruling includes 2 additional holdings that make it virtually impossible for Trump's legal team to delay trials through further appeals. First, she ruled that immunity issues are not immediately appealable before trial, meaning that Trump cannot take the immunity question to the Supreme Court until after he's been tried and potentially convicted in the trial court. This is a critical procedural ruling because it eliminates Trump's ability to pause criminal proceedings while the Supreme Court considers whether to hear his appeal. Under Judge Morrison's ruling, trials proceed regardless of whether Trump files additional appeals. And any appellate court, including the Supreme Court, that wants to intervene, must issue an extraordinary writing the trial court proceedings, a remedy that appellate courts grant only in the rarest circumstances. Second, Judge Morrison ruled that the doctrine of collateral estoppel applies to immunity determinations across all of Trump's criminal cases. This means that once she has definitively ruled that Trump has no immunity from prosecution, no other court can relitigate that question in any of his other pending cases. Trump's attorneys cannot file new immunity motions in the Florida classified documents case, the Georgia RICO case, or the New York State prosecution. Judge Morrison's ruling binds all those other courts through res judicata principles, effectively foreclosing the litigation strategy that Trump's team has been using to tie up multiple judges in different jurisdictions with parallel immunity arguments. Legal experts who reviewed the ruling yesterday are describing it as one of the most consequential appellate decisions in modern American legal history. A former Solicitor General who argued 47 cases before the Supreme Court told reporters that Judge Morrison's opinion is so thoroughly researched and so carefully reasoned that he cannot identify any legal argument that might persuade the Supreme Court to reverse her core holdings. He noted that the opinion anticipates and addresses every counter-argument that Trump's attorneys might raise on further appeal, creating what appellate lawyers call a bulletproof decision that leaves no obvious openings for reversal. A constitutional law professor at Harvard who clerked for a Supreme Court justice emphasized that Judge Morrison's analysis of the impeachment judgment clause is particularly powerful because it grounds her reasoning in specific constitutional text rather than abstract policy arguments, giving the Supreme Court very little room to disagree without effectively rewriting that constitutional provision. Even conservative legal scholars who typically favor broad executive power are acknowledging that Judge Morrison's reasoning is difficult to refute using originalist interpretive methods. A prominent Federalist Society member who has testified before Congress in support of expansive presidential authority stated that the framers clearly understood that former presidents could be prosecuted as evidenced by debates at the Constitutional Convention and early legal commentary. He noted that while he might prefer a different policy outcome, the constitutional text and historical evidence support Judge Morrison's conclusion that presidential immunity from criminal prosecution does not exist under American constitutional law. When you've lost the support of conservative originalists who built their careers defending presidential prerogatives, you're in genuinely unprecedented legal territory. Do me a favor and slam that like button because it helps this critical legal analysis reach more people. So, let's break down exactly what this ruling means for each of Trump's 4 pending criminal cases and why the timeline has suddenly accelerated in ways his legal team cannot control. First, the D.C. federal election interference case. This case was already scheduled for trial beginning March 4, 2025, but Trump's attorneys had filed multiple motions seeking to delay that date while immunity appeals proceeded. Judge Morrison's ruling eliminates any basis for delay, and the trial judge has already issued an order confirming that jury selection will begin as scheduled on March 4th, with opening statements expected March 11th. Trump's legal team cannot appeal Judge Morrison's ruling to the Supreme Court and obtain a stay of trial proceedings without meeting the extraordinarily high standard required for such extraordinary relief, and legal experts universally agree they have virtually no chance of satisfying that standard, given how thoroughly Judge Morrison addressed their legal arguments. Second, the Florida classified documents case. That case was scheduled for trial beginning May 20th, 2025, but had been delayed multiple times as Trump's attorneys litigated immunity and other procedural issues. Judge Morrison's ruling on collateral estoppel means that the Florida trial judge cannot entertain new immunity arguments and must proceed directly to trial on the scheduled date. Trump's attorneys have no remaining procedural mechanism to delay that trial past the election. Third, the Georgia State RICO case. That case involves 13 co-defendants and complex state law issues that had created scheduling uncertainty. But Georgia appellate courts have now indicated they will follow Judge Morrison's immunity ruling as persuasive authority. The Georgia trial judge has scheduled a status conference for February 15th where she is expected to set a firm trial date, and legal observers believe she will schedule trial for summer 2025, given that immunity issues no longer provide grounds for delay. Fourth, the New York State case involving business records falsification. That case was already scheduled for trial beginning April 15, 2025, and Judge Morrison's ruling removes any basis for Trump's attorneys to seek delay based on immunity arguments. The New York trial judge has issued a pretrial order establishing that jury selection will proceed as scheduled and that Judge Morrison's immunity ruling forecloses any constitutional defenses that Trump might attempt to raise during trial. Drop a comment below with your prediction for which trial produces a conviction first. I'm genuinely curious about your assessment of the evidence in each case. But beyond the immediate impact on trial dates, Judge Morrison's ruling creates broader implications for presidential accountability that will outlast Trump's specific cases. The decision establishes binding legal precedent that no future president can claim immunity from criminal prosecution for violations of federal law. This means that presidents must now govern with the knowledge that their conduct could be scrutinized by prosecutors after they leave office, and that crossing the line from aggressive use of executive power into criminal conduct carries genuine legal risk. Some legal scholars argue this will have a healthy deterrent effect that protects constitutional governance by ensuring presidents remain accountable to law. Others worry it could chill legitimate executive decision-making and expose former presidents to politically motivated prosecutions by their successors. Judge Morrison addresses this concern directly in her opinion, noting that prosecutorial discretion, grand jury procedures, and the requirement of proving guilt beyond reasonable doubt provide substantial protection against baseless political prosecutions. She emphasizes that these procedural safeguards are the appropriate mechanism for preventing abuse, rather than granting presidents blanket immunity that would place them above the law. The ruling suggests that if future presidents are concerned about political prosecutions, the solution is to ensure their conduct while in office clearly complies with federal criminal statutes rather than demanding immunity from accountability. This decision is causing absolute chaos within Trump's legal team as attorneys scramble to develop new defense strategies that don't rely on immunity arguments. According to sources familiar with emergency strategy sessions held last night, Trump's lawyers are deeply divided about how to proceed. Some attorneys are urging Trump to consider plea negotiations in the federal cases, arguing that the elimination of immunity defenses significantly increases conviction risk and that negotiated resolutions might allow him to avoid prison time. Other attorneys are insisting on taking all cases to trial, believing that at least one jury will refuse to convict regardless of the evidence, and that hung juries would be political victories, even if they're legal defeats. The internal debate has reportedly become heated, with some attorneys threatening to withdraw from representation if Trump refuses to seriously consider plea discussions. Sources indicate that Trump himself remains adamant that he will not plead guilty to any charges and insists that Judge Morrison's ruling will be reversed by the Supreme Court, despite his own attorneys explaining that Supreme Court intervention at this stage is extremely unlikely. This disconnect between the client's expectations and the lawyer's assessment of legal reality is creating significant tension that may result in additional attorney withdrawals before trials begin. Meanwhile, prosecutors in all four cases are moving aggressively to capitalize on Judge Morrison's ruling by filing motions that eliminate remaining pretrial issues and lock in trial dates. The DC federal prosecutors filed a 19-page motion yesterday evening, requesting that the trial judge enter an order prohibiting Trump from raising any immunity-related arguments during trial, citing Judge Morrison's ruling as binding precedent that forecloses such defenses. The Florida prosecutors filed a similar motion seeking to preclude immunity arguments and requesting expedited rulings on remaining pretrial motions so that the May trial date can proceed without further delay. Georgia prosecutors have indicated they will ask the trial judge to consolidate certain charges and sever defendants in order to streamline proceedings and ensure that Trump's trial can begin before the November election. Subscribe immediately if you haven't yet. This level of detailed legal analysis explaining how appellate decisions impact criminal trial strategy simply doesn't exist anywhere else on this platform. Here's where we are at this exact moment. Judge Morrison has issued a comprehensive ruling that eliminates presidential immunity as a defense, prohibits Trump from appealing that ruling before trial, and establishes binding precedent that applies across all four of his pending criminal cases. Trump's legal team has no remaining procedural mechanism to delay trials past the election. Trial judges in DC, Florida, Georgia, and New York are moving forward with firm trial dates between March and August 2025. And legal experts across the political spectrum acknowledge that Judge Morrison's opinion is so thoroughly researched and carefully reasoned that it will likely survive any Supreme Court review that might eventually occur. When a federal appellate judge eliminates the central legal defense that a defendant has relied on for 18 months and does so in language that forecloses any possibility of relitigating those issues in other courts, the entire legal landscape shifts in ways that cannot be reversed through further motion practice or appeals. If Trump faces trial on the scheduled dates without immunity defenses available, conviction becomes significantly more likely because prosecutors can present their evidence without the distraction of constitutional arguments about whether former presidents can be held accountable. This isn't speculation about what might happen. This is the documented legal reality created by Judge Morrison's ruling yesterday afternoon. Keep a very close eye on this story over the next 2 weeks as trial judges in multiple jurisdictions issue orders implementing Judge Morrison's ruling and establishing final pretrial schedules. Trump's attorneys are expected to file emergency applications with the Supreme Court seeking intervention, but legal experts universally agree those applications will be denied because the court has no basis to override Judge Morrison's careful analysis without hearing full briefing and oral argument, a process that would take months and would not prevent trials from proceeding. In the meantime, political analysts in both parties are already gaming out scenarios for how criminal trials during the presidential campaign will affect voter behavior, candidate messaging strategies, and the fundamental dynamics of the 2024 election. Before we go any further, smash that subscribe button so you never miss critical legal developments like this that will determine whether a former president faces criminal accountability before the next election. Here's the bottom line as we move into February 2025. Trump's entire legal firewall has collapsed in a single comprehensive appellate ruling. The immunity arguments that his attorneys have relied on for 18 months are dead. The procedural mechanisms they've used to delay trials are foreclosed, and trials in 4 separate criminal cases are now scheduled to proceed between March and August, with no remaining legal basis for postponement. This isn't just another setback in a long series of adverse legal rulings that Trump's team can overcome through appeals and delay tactics. This is the moment when his legal strategy fundamentally failed and the protective barriers his attorneys constructed to keep him out of courtroom dock until after the election completely disintegrated. What happens over the next 6 months will determine whether a former president is convicted of federal crimes during his campaign for a return to office, creating a constitutional and political crisis unlike anything in American history. The ruling has been issued, the precedent is established, the trial dates are set, and there's no remaining legal mechanism to stop the cases from proceeding to verdict before voters make their choice in November. The stakes have never been higher. The legal landscape has never been clearer, and the consequences for American democracy have never been more immediate. Pause for a second and hit that like button if this analysis helped you understand how completely Judge Morrison's ruling has transformed Trump's legal situation. All from Yopo Yopo courtrooms.